In the dry heat of a Mesopotamian dawn around 1800 BC, long before the rise of Greece and centuries before Rome was even imagined, the city of Babylon stirred awake under the faint glow of a rising sun. Clay brick houses shimmered under the first light, the Euphrates rolled with its steady murmur, and the sacred ziggurat called Etymonanke towered over everything like a stairway leading directly into the realm of the gods. Inside the temple courtyards another world existed. It was quieter, colder, and wrapped in rituals that ordinary Babylonians rarely understood. These rituals were guarded with strict secrecy by the priestly class, a group of men who held immense authority. Their words shaped politics, guided kings, interpreted omens, and defined moral boundaries for the entire population. But deep inside the temple chambers, hidden behind thick walls of baked brick, the priests also conducted ceremonies that have troubled historians for centuries. These rituals centered around purification, fertility, and religious symbolism. In particular, they involved young male initiates who came to the temple as virgins, often offering themselves to the gods, believing that the rituals performed on them were sacred, divine, and essential for the spiritual health of the kingdom. To understand what happened in those chambers, it is important to recognize the nature of Babylonian religion. This civilization viewed the world as a constant struggle between order and chaos. Every ritual was meant to maintain balance, ensure the favor of the gods, and prevent disaster. The belief was simple yet powerful. If rituals were not performed exactly as prescribed, the gods would abandon the city, causing drought, famine, or war. Priests, therefore, possessed absolute control. However, most of the information we have about these rituals does not come from the priests. It comes from clay tablets written by scribes, from the records of rival civilizations like the Greeks, and from later chronicles that looked back at Mesopotamian practices with a mixture of fascination and horror. These sources describe purification rites that could be extremely intense, symbolic ceremonies involving control, submission, and psychological domination. None of these rituals involved modern definitions of physical harm, but they were deeply invasive spiritually, emotionally, and socially. One of the clearest descriptions comes from later writings referencing the young males prepared for temple service in honor of the god Marduk. According to these accounts, male virgins chosen for such rituals were typically between early adolescence and young adulthood. They were selected because purity was believed to create a stronger connection to the divine. Their innocence was not a weakness but a vessel through which the gods were believed to act. This belief elevated them, but it also placed them at the mercy of the priestly class. Babylonian society functioned under strict religious hierarchy. A young initiate offered to the temple had no voice in the structure around him. His family often considered it an honor. The priests, trained from childhood, followed rituals without question because they were convinced that their actions preserved cosmic order. This combination of authority and belief created a space where psychological and ritualistic control became normalized. The first stage of the initiation involved separation from ordinary life. The young male was isolated in a small temple chamber for several days. There he underwent purification ceremonies that included fasting, bathing in cold water, and reciting hymns for hours. Historians interpret this as a form of sensory deprivation mixed with religious discipline. Its purpose was to break attachment to the outside world and reshape the initiate's identity into one devoted entirely to the gods. Babylonian temples were not just places of worship. They were economic centers, political hubs, and schools of advanced knowledge. Priests understood astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. They were influential advisors to kings. But their power also meant that no one questioned the rituals they conducted, even when those rituals placed heavy emotional pressure on young initiates. Inside the dimly lit purification hall, the priests would chant long incantations addressing gods like Shamash, Marduk, and Enki. The young initiate was required to stand motionless for extended periods. These rituals were meant to test his obedience and endurance. If he faltered, it was interpreted as a sign that he was spiritually unworthy. The psychological burden was immense, especially since failure could bring shame not just to him but to his family. The second stage of the ritual emphasized symbolic submission. Priests believed that for an initiate to serve the gods, he had to abandon worldly pride. Historical tablets mention symbolic actions in which the initiate demonstrated humility before the divine. These acts were not physical punishments, but deeply symbolic gestures meant to strip away ego and reinforce the dominance of the priesthood. Such rituals often included kneeling, chanting sacred lines repeatedly, or participating in reenactments of mythological stories that illustrated obedience to higher powers. One of the most misunderstood aspects is the binding ritual. Early Greek writers who visited Babylon described it as mysterious and alarming, but modern historians interpret it differently. The binding ritual likely symbolized the initiate's surrender to divine will rather than any harmful physical act. It was meant to represent the binding of human desire in service to cosmic order. Still, to an outsider, the visual imagery could look intimidating. A young initiate, surrounded by chanting priests, his hands ritually tied with ceremonial rope, standing before the altar of a towering god statue lit by burning oil lamps, would have felt trapped between human authority and unseen divine expectations. The weight of that moment could crush any sense of personal freedom. By the time the third stage arrived, the initiate was deeply immersed in the temple world. The priests then performed what they called the unveiling, a ritual in which the initiate received sacred teachings that ordinary people were never allowed to hear. These teachings often revolved around cosmology and myths explaining the gods, creation, and the purpose of humanity. But they also reinforced the idea that the temple held absolute truth, and that the priests alone were interpreters of divine will. What made these rituals historically important was their impact on Babylonian society. The young men who underwent them emerged as temple servants, scribes, or assistants in rituals that influenced political decisions. Their minds shaped by intense psychological conditioning, they believed wholeheartedly in their role as mediators between humans and gods. This helped Babylon maintain its religious structure for centuries. But the secrecy surrounding these rituals also created the environment for misunderstandings, exaggerations, and later horror stories. When Greek historians like Herodotus visited Mesopotamia centuries later, they were disturbed by the level of control priests held over initiates. Their writings tended to sensationalize what they saw, portraying Babylonian rituals as far darker than modern scholars believe they were. Still, these accounts hint that the priesthood exercised extreme psychological dominance, especially over those who entered the temple as pure, inexperienced youths hoping to serve the gods. By the end of Section 1, we have not yet reached the most controversial parts of Babylonian temple practice. Instead, we stand on the threshold, looking into a world where religion, power, and secrecy interlocked so tightly that young male initiates found themselves lost within a system they revered yet feared. What happened next inside those chambers became the subject of intense debate among ancient writers, later historians, and modern researchers. Whether symbolic or literal, the rituals they describe would go on to become some of the most unsettling examples of priestly authority in early human civilization. By the early 2nd millennium BC, Babylon had become a world of strict order, ruled not only by kings but by rituals. Every sunrise was interpreted as a message from the gods, every storm was a divine sign, every illness was believed to reflect cosmic imbalance, and behind all of this stood the priesthood, the only group claiming to understand the mysterious language of the heavens. Inside the temple complex dedicated to Marduk, the air felt heavier than anywhere else in the city. The courtyards bustled with servants preparing oil lamps, sweeping clay floors, and carrying heavy jars of water from the Euphrates for purification ceremonies. But beyond these outer spaces, deeper rooms existed where the public never entered. These inner chambers gave the priesthood near-absolute authority over the young male initiates chosen to serve. To an ordinary Babylonian, these youths were blessed. They had been selected by the gods, purified through ritual, and destined for sacred service. Families often felt honored, believing that their son's presence in the temple brought divine protection to their household. But for the boys themselves, the reality was far more complicated. The moment an initiate crossed into the inner sanctum, he left behind the only world he knew. He entered a maze of cold stone rooms, torchlit corridors, and chambers echoing with the steady murmurs of priestly chants. Those echoes never seemed to stop. They were constant, like the beating of a drum reminding him that he was no longer a child of Babylon, but a servant of the gods. The first chamber he entered after isolation was known as the Chamber of Breath. Its name came from a sacred belief that breath connected mortals to the divine. Priests taught that when a human breathed, they were inhaling the invisible essence of the gods that sustained creation. The ritual conducted here was meant to bring the initiate closer to this understanding. The initiate was made to sit on the floor while senior priests walked slowly around him, chanting in Akkadian. The room was filled with fragrant smoke produced by burning cedar resin, myrrh, and aromatic herbs. The smoke symbolized divine presence, and inhaling it was believed to purify the soul. But the smoke was dense, and breathing became difficult. Many initiates described dizziness and disorientation afterward, according to later accounts recited by temple scribes. It was a psychological test disguised as a spiritual act. Once this phase ended, the initiate was escorted to the chamber of binding. This room plays a major role in the historical debate surrounding Babylonian rituals. Greek writers who visited Mesopotamia later exaggerated it, describing it in more sinister ways, but modern scholars view it as a symbolic ceremony rooted in mythology. The initiate stood before an altar carved with symbols of Marduk's victory over the forces of chaos. Priests wrapped ceremonial ropes around his hands, not to cause harm, but to represent the restraint of human desire. The message was simple. Before serving the gods, one had to conquer pride, fear, and worldly attachment. In Babylonian cosmology, human weakness threatened order. Binding symbolized the triumph of discipline over temptation. Still, the psychological effect of this ceremony was immense. Being tied, surrounded by powerful religious figures, and told that the fate of the city depended on one's obedience could overwhelm any young mind. The initiate's heart raced. His palms grew wet despite the cool stone beneath his feet. Everything around him felt larger than life, as though the chamber itself was watching. The priests recited long incantations, describing ancient battles among the gods. These stories were more than myths. They formed the blueprint for Babylonian society. Every action, every law, every ritual was modeled on divine events. The initiate was told he was reenacting those battles through symbolic submission, becoming part of a cosmic story stretching back to creation. Once the binding ended, the ropes were removed, and the initiate was guided to another chamber known as the Hall of Echoes. Historians believe this room was specially designed for acoustic resonance. Its walls were curved to make sound travel in unusual ways. When priests chanted, their voices multiplied, seeming to come from every direction. To a young initiate already disoriented from fasting, smoke, and ritual pressure, the effect could feel otherworldly. In this chamber, the priests began teaching sacred doctrines. These included the roles of the gods, the responsibilities of humans in maintaining order, and the importance of obedience to the temple hierarchy. But teaching was not gentle or welcoming, it was overwhelming by design. The priests did not simply speak, they chanted, their voices bouncing around the curved walls, creating a soundscape that made the initiate feel small and powerless. This method was effective. Within hours, many initiates became psychologically conditioned to accept the authority of the priesthood without question. To refuse meant spiritual failure, social shame, and the belief that one had disappointed the gods. This emotional burden was one of the most important tools used by the priesthood to establish control. The ritual then shifted to the chamber of reflection. Here, the initiate sat alone facing a polished bronze plate used as a mirror. Babylonian beliefs held that water and metal surfaces were gateways to spiritual truths. The initiate stared at his reflection as priests recited verses about human fragility and the journey from childhood to spiritual adulthood. This was considered one of the most intense rituals. Staring at one's reflection while surrounded by smoke and distant chants created a surreal atmosphere. Initiates described feeling as though they were confronting their inner self, stripped of pride and fear. Some later writings from temple scribes claim that initiates often cried during this ritual, not from pain, but from the emotional weight of the experience. After hours of chanting and reflection, the priests returned and placed a ceremonial robe on the initiate's shoulders. This robe symbolized rebirth, but the initiate was not yet considered spiritually transformed. Before that could happen, he had to pass through the most feared stage of all, the chamber of judgment. Despite the name, this ritual did not involve harm. It was entirely psychological. The initiate stood before 3 senior priests who represented divine authority. They questioned him about his purity, his obedience, his fears, and his devotion. The questions were designed to confuse and unsettle. Sometimes the priests spoke in riddles. Other times they used silence as a weapon, staring at the initiate until he began to doubt his worthiness. This ritual was meant to test inner resilience. If the initiate broke down emotionally, it was seen as a sign that he needed further purification. The pressure was enormous. Every initiate wanted to prove himself worthy, and every priest wanted to ensure that no one entered temple service without complete spiritual submission. Once the chamber of judgment ended, the initiate returned to the inner courtyard, exhausted but transformed. He had spent hours being tested, questioned, restrained, overwhelmed by smoke and sound, and forced to confront his own identity. Yet he believed every moment had been necessary. Babylonian culture taught that the gods demanded absolute devotion, and the temple's role was to shape individuals into perfect servants. The significance of these rituals extended far beyond the temple walls. Initiates who passed them became scribes, guardians of sacred knowledge, advisors, record keepers, astrologers, and ritual assistants. They formed the intellectual backbone of Babylonian civilization. Their psychological transformation ensured loyalty to the temple above all else, including their own families. But where some saw spiritual awakening, others saw manipulation. Foreign visitors found the rituals disturbing. Greek and later Roman writers described Babylonian priesthood as harsh and overly controlling. They implied that priests exploited the innocence of young initiates to reinforce their power. These outside accounts, though often exaggerated, contributed to Babylon's long-standing reputation for dark and secretive religious practices. Yet the truth is more complex. The rituals were not created to harm young initiates, but to mold them into instruments of order in a world feared to be fragile and unpredictable. To Babylon, chaos was always waiting just beyond the horizon. Rituals kept it at bay, and the initiates who endured these ceremonies emerged with a sense of purpose, convinced that their transformation was essential for the survival of their city. Still, what occurred next in the deeper chambers would spark centuries of debate. Some sources describe rituals that symbolically represented cosmic battles, struggles between purity and temptation, and the surrender of earthly identity to divine will. Whether these acts were literal or symbolic remains controversial. But their psychological impact on the young initiates was undeniable. These rituals, shrouded in secrecy and amplified by fear, would be remembered as some of the most haunting ceremonies in ancient religious history. By the time an initiate reached the third phase of the Babylonian temple system, he was no longer the same person who had entered the outer gates days earlier. The isolation, the symbolic binding, the heavy incense, the relentless chanting, the psychological pressure, and the confrontation in the chamber of judgment had already reshaped his sense of self. Now he was ready to enter the part of the temple ordinary citizens never heard about, and foreign writers dramatized for centuries, the Inner Sanctum. To Babylonian priests, this sanctum was not a place of fear, but of cosmic duty. Everything inside had symbolic meaning. Every movement, every spoken word, every flicker of oil lamp light carried religious importance. But to young initiates who entered trembling but obedient, the atmosphere felt overwhelming, even suffocating. The Inner Sanctum was built at the center of the temple, beneath the towering ziggurat. It had no windows. Its walls were thick, absorbing sound rather than reflecting it. Torches burned low, creating shadows that shifted and stretched across the floor. At the center stood a polished stone altar carved with scenes from Babylonian creation myths. Marduk's battle against Tiamat, the formation of the heavens, and the establishment of order over chaos. These carvings reminded everyone who entered that humans existed only to maintain divine balance. The initiate was led to the altar by senior priests whose robes trailed across the stone floor. Their gold and lazuli ornaments shimmered in the low light, reflecting the wealth and power of the temple. These men were not simply religious figures. They were political actors, astronomers, healers, judges, and advisors to kings. Their authority shaped the direction of Babylonian society. In the sanctum, the priesthood performed rituals that scholars still debate. Ancient Greek accounts, written centuries later, described these ceremonies in frightening detail, emphasizing intimidation, spiritual surrender, and profound psychological impact. But modern historians believe many of those descriptions were exaggerated or misunderstood. The rituals were not designed to cause harm, but rather to break the initiate's attachments to the outside world and reform him as an instrument of divine will. One of the most controversial ceremonies was known in later texts as the rite of purity. This ritual was not physically dangerous, but emotionally overwhelming. Its purpose was to demonstrate that the initiate, still a male virgin, embodied spiritual innocence. In Babylonian belief, purity allowed the gods to work through a person without interference from worldly desires. The initiate's virginity symbolized clarity, readiness, and a mind unclouded by distraction. Priests surrounded him in a circle and recited long incantations that invoked the gods of wisdom, justice, and creation. The chants grew louder and louder, filling the chamber with rhythmic echoes. The initiate was required to maintain absolute stillness, standing in the center as the priests circled him. This was not easy. The air felt heavy. The smoke from the incense stung his eyes. The pressure of so many watchful faces made his pulse race. But he was expected to remain calm, proving his spiritual discipline. The symbolism of this ritual was profound. The circle of priests represented divine guardianship. Their chants represented cosmic order. The initiate, standing alone in the center, symbolized humanity's place between the gods above and the forces of chaos below. If he wavered or flinched, it meant he lacked inner stability. The psychological impact of this moment was tremendous. Many initiates wrote in later tablets that they felt as though they were being judged not by humans but by the gods themselves. After the rite of purity, the initiate was led to a narrow corridor, illuminated by a single oil lamp. This passageway represented the path between the mortal world and the realm of divine truth. At the end of the corridor was a heavy wooden door carved with symbols of snakes, stars, and flowing water. These carvings were not decorative. They represented ancient deities associated with knowledge and transformation. This door led to the Chamber of Surrender, a place that would later inspire countless exaggerated tales among Greek writers who misunderstood its purpose. In this chamber, the initiate underwent rituals meant to symbolize the surrender of ego. Babylonian priests believed that pride was the root of chaos, and only by renouncing it could a person serve the gods with purity. The ritual began with silence. The initiate sat on the floor, legs crossed, hands resting on his knees. Priests stood around him, holding bronze mirrors that reflected torchlight onto his face. The flickering reflections created shifting patterns on the walls, producing an almost dreamlike effect. The initiate was required to confess his fears aloud. Not sins, but fears: fear of failing the gods, fear of disappointing his family, fear of losing control, fear of the unknown. These confessions were believed to cleanse the mind. The priests responded with verses from sacred texts, describing how even gods experienced fear during the creation battle. This was a profound psychological moment. Fear, according to Babylonian theology, did not make a person weak. It made them human. By admitting fear, the initiate showed humility. By accepting divine guidance, he demonstrated trust. Next came the chant of remolding. Priests spoke verses that described how Marduk shaped the world from the remains of chaos. That creation story symbolized transformation, and the initiate was taught that he too was being reshaped into a servant of cosmic order. The chant reinforced the idea that his old identity had been left outside the temple. A new identity would emerge from the rituals he endured. After this, the initiate was brought to a second altar, smaller than the first, where symbolic objects were placed. These objects varied depending on the time period and temple, but commonly included 1. A clay tablet, representing knowledge 2. A small bronze blade, representing discipline 3. A sealed jar, representing inner purity 4. A wooden figurine, representing human frailty. Each object had a specific meaning. The tablet reminded him that his future role involved writing, record, keeping and interpreting divine messages. The bronze blade symbolized sharpness of mind and the cutting away of falsehood. The sealed jar symbolized the need to protect purity of thought. The figurine reminded him that humans remained fragile and dependent on divine order. The initiate placed his hands over these objects while the priests recited incantations. This symbolic gesture represented his acceptance of the burdens and responsibilities of temple service. It was not easy. The weight of expectation pressed heavily on him. By touching the objects, he accepted his role as a mediator between humans and gods. Then came the ritual that most foreign writers misunderstood and sensationalized: the veiling of the mind. Priests placed a thin cloth over the initiate's eyes and recited hymns describing the journey from ignorance to enlightenment. The cloth was not meant to blind, but to symbolize inner reflection. With darkness covering his vision, the initiate was forced to listen, to think, and to trust. The priests walked slowly around him, tapping wooden staffs on the stone floor in a slow rhythmic pattern. The sound echoed through the chamber, creating a hypnotic effect. This ritual could last an hour or more. Some initiates described it as peaceful. Others said it made them feel lost, as though they were floating between the human and divine realms. When the cloth was finally removed, the initiate saw the altar again, illuminated by a brighter flame than before. Priests interpreted this moment as symbolic rebirth, the transition from spiritual blindness to divine awareness. In Babylonian tradition, enlightenment did not mean gaining new knowledge, but gaining new perspective. These rituals were powerful, profound, and deeply psychological, but they were also dangerous in a different way. They placed immense emotional vulnerability in the hands of the priesthood. The absolute trust demanded of the initiates gave priests enormous influence. Foreigners often misinterpreted this influence as cruelty. Greek writers described the rituals as terrifying acts of domination. Some even claimed that Babylonian priests physically humiliated initiates. These stories, though dramatic, were likely distortions born from cultural misunderstanding. Still, we cannot ignore that the rituals were intense, overwhelming, and designed to break the initiate's former identity. The transformation they produced was real. Once the third phase ended, the initiate no longer saw himself as an ordinary young man. He believed he had been chosen by the gods, shaped by sacred rites, and molded into an instrument of cosmic order. What awaited him in the final stage would determine whether he became a full temple servant, a scribe, or an assistant to the high priests. That final stage would reveal the temple's greatest secrets and the full weight of Babylonian priestly power. By the time dawn approached over Babylon, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, the young initiate stood on the threshold of the last and most decisive stage of his journey. He had passed through isolation, symbolic binding, confession, reflection, veiling, and the psychological storms of the inner sanctum. Now he faced the final ceremony, one that determined whether he was worthy of entering the sacred ranks of the temple's learned class. This ceremony, known in later writings as the Rite of Ascension, took place in the deepest chamber of the temple. Unlike the earlier sanctums carved from stone, this chamber was constructed with cedar beams imported from distant mountains. The wood carried a strong fragrance, making the air feel warmer and more alive. This design reflected Babylon's belief that the final transformation should occur in a place representing life and rebirth, not the cold permanence of stone. The chamber was dimly lit, with only a single oil lamp burning at the center. The flickering flame cast long shadows that danced across the floor. The walls were decorated with clay reliefs showing Marduk receiving divine power from older gods, symbolizing the transfer of wisdom and authority. This imagery was intentional. The initiate would symbolically receive similar spiritual authority from the priesthood. The first stage of this final ritual was the recitation of the celestial tablets. These were sacred verses memorized by priests from childhood, describing the movements of stars, the cycles of seasons, and the harmony between the heavens and earth. Babylon's priests believed that understanding the heavens allowed humans to predict the future and maintain order. The initiate listened in silence, absorbing every word as though the stars themselves were speaking. Once the recitation ended, the initiate was instructed to approach a low altar holding several symbolic objects. These were different from the earlier objects used in Section 3. Here, each item represented the roles and responsibilities the initiate would carry for the rest of his life. 3 main objects awaited him. 1. A stylus made of reed, symbolizing the power of the written word. 2. A small bowl of clean water, symbolizing clarity of judgment. 3. A clay seal representing authority to witness and validate important decisions. Each object carried tremendous weight in Babylonian society. Temples were the heart of record keeping, and scribes were among the most respected members of society. Water symbolized purity of thought, and the seal represented trustworthiness. Only those who passed the final ceremony were allowed to wield these items in service to the temple and the gods. The initiate touched each object in silence. This act symbolized his acceptance of the responsibilities that came with temple service. He was no longer simply a young man who had undergone purification rituals. He was now stepping into a role that required intellect, discipline, and unshakable devotion. After this symbolic acceptance, the priests guided him to a raised platform known as the seat of witness. From here, he would face his final test, the ritual of truth. Unlike earlier trials, the ritual of truth did not involve incense, chanting, or symbolic blindness. It was a direct test of character. 3 senior priests, chosen for their wisdom and status, sat before him and asked a series of difficult questions. Are you prepared to place the needs of the gods above your own desires? Are you willing to protect sacred knowledge? Even if others demand it, are you able to remain silent when silence protects the divine order? Do you understand that your role serves not only the temple, but the entire kingdom? Do you accept that your purity of mind must be guarded at all costs. The questions were not meant to trap him. They were meant to ensure that he understood the weight of his role. Babylon was a vast city woven with politics, religion, trade, and law. A temple servant influenced all these domains. A careless word from such a person could create panic, disrupt rituals, or disrespect the gods. The initiate answered each question with calm determination. His voice, though soft, carried conviction. He had endured fear, exhaustion, spiritual pressure, and overwhelming rituals. Now he stood with clarity, understanding why the initiation had been so intense. It had stripped away his uncertainty and replaced it with purpose. Once the ritual of truth concluded, the high priest stepped forward. The high priest was the most powerful religious figure in Babylon, second only to the king in influence. He served as the chief interpreter of omens, guardian of sacred traditions, and voice of Marduk's earthly will. He placed his hand on the initiate's head and recited a blessing in ancient Akkadian, a language reserved for sacred rites. The blessing praised the gods for guiding the initiate, tested his strength, and purified his spirit. It also entrusted him with a heavy responsibility to preserve knowledge, mediate between heaven and earth, and uphold the moral and cosmic order of Babylon. After the blessing, the high priest placed a narrow woven band around the initiate's forehead. This band, called the Circle of Devotion, marked the initiate as a full servant of the gods. Its symbolism was powerful. It represented knowledge, obedience, and the continuous cycle of cosmic balance. Wearing it was both an honor and a burden. The final act of the ritual was the lighting of the sacred flame. The initiate approached the central oil lamp, dipped a reed into the flame, and used it to light 2 additional lamps placed on either side of the altar. This simple gesture represented enlightenment, the spreading of wisdom, and the initiate's contribution to sustaining divine order. As the lamps glowed warmly, the priests chanted a final hymn celebrating the initiate's transformation. The sound, unlike earlier rituals, was soft, gentle, and uplifting. For the first time since entering the temple, the initiate felt peace rather than pressure. He was no longer trapped between fear and expectation. He had crossed into a new identity with clarity and pride. When the ceremony ended, he stepped out of the chamber wearing the circle of devotion. Temple servants bowed as he passed. Scribes greeted him with respectful nods. He was now one of them. His life would revolve around studying star charts, maintaining records, assisting in rituals, offering guidance to the community, and preserving the ancient knowledge that defined Babylon's identity. This transformation was not merely personal. It had cultural consequences. The temple system depended on individuals who respected the rituals, understood the symbolism, and maintained unwavering loyalty to the gods. By molding initiates through such intense psychological and spiritual processes, Babylon ensured that its religious structure remained stable for centuries. Foreign visitors who wrote about Babylon often misunderstood these rituals. They described them as frightening, oppressive, or cruel. They imagined physical torment or humiliation. But modern historians recognize that most accounts were exaggerations shaped by cultural bias. The true emphasis of Babylonian initiation was discipline, devotion, and psychological transformation, not physical harm. The rituals were intense because Babylonian religion viewed the universe as fragile. One mistake, one bad omen, one failed ceremony could unleash chaos. In a world without modern science, rituals were the only perceived line of defense. That belief gave priests immense power and placed enormous responsibility on young initiates. In the end, the initiate's story reflected the broader narrative of ancient Mesopotamian culture. A civilization striving to understand cosmic order, fearing the forces of chaos, and trusting deeply in rituals that shaped minds, guided rulers, and preserved society. For the young male virgin who entered the temple seeking a path of spiritual service, the experience was life altering.